everything is going to be all right. Okay, I will stop there. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Ramana. I'd like to invite our three panelists now to share their videos so that we can have a short discussion. We have about 31 minutes left in this session, and I'd like to leave a good chunk of time for committee members to ask their questions. So I want to ask just a couple now. The first is to Tom. Many of the engagement strategies that you listed seem to be rooted in a perception that messaging is the problem. You know, the industry, the enterprises, let's use that word, or establishment's messaging has been problematic. I'm wondering if the establishment has focused on process to the same extent. To what extent do they believe that engaging with the public through licensing proceedings and other adversarial institutions could be the problem? And have they tried some political engineering to find another process that the public might consider much more acceptable? And before we spend some time thinking about this political engineering of a better process, would that solve the lack of trust issue?
To answer the last question first, I'm not sure it would. At least history doesn't, give you good confidence that it would. I mean, I think when it comes to the licensing process, what you did find is that there was a great deal of criticism in the 1960s and 1970s about the process, and that intervener groups were not allowed to raise issues that were important to them. And this in part is because of the way the Atomic Energy Act of 1954 is constructed and the kind of limitations that were placed on intervening proceedings. On the other hand, I think in some ways, licensing panels tried to accommodate that. And, there's a lot of complaints sometimes by the industry that boards that heard these hearings bent over backwards to admit interveners to the proceedings and hear their various issues that they were raised. That the experts that they brought to bear on issues were not qualified. So these are the complaints by the industry. So I think in a kind of ad hoc way, they did try to expand the proceedings in a way that admitted more of the complaints that interveners brought. But ultimately, I think that in the cases where groups were most successful in doing that, it raised more alarm over the safety of reactors than perhaps might have occurred otherwise. As I gave the example of Shoreham, but that's certainly also the case for places like Diablo Canyon, Seabrook, kind of the big three of major intervening proceedings. So yeah, I mean, there were efforts to try to admit interveners, but I think ultimately, there's a lot of complaints that these kind of legal proceedings do not get towards some sort of truth, whether the interveners were correct or whether the experts on the NRC side were correct. That's not a good place to try to shape public opinion.
I was actually thinking of the San Onofre Community Engagement Panel, which explicitly has no decision-making authority and includes elected representatives and first responders, who are generally parts of the population that are a bit more trustworthy than the industry. I'd like to throw that same question to Spencer and Ramana and ask if there is political engineering to be done to make the process better if it's a process problem. Spencer?
I'll turn that over to Ramana. I don't have nearly the expertise in it that he and Tom have.
Yeah, I mean, this is a very difficult question. I kind of alluded to it a bit when I mentioned the problem of conflicting priorities. In many cases, if the government is promoting nuclear power or wants to expand nuclear power fast, they are not under any kind of, they have no incentive to actually make the process more fair and more deliberative, right? And I think there's a problem with that. So I think that, if you start with the question that nuclear power has to expand, then automatically that is a problem with the process. I mean, you have to start with questions like, should we have nuclear power at all? Should this particular plant be built? And you have to go with if the industry or any of their representatives were to go to a community and say, look, we want to build a nuclear plant here, and in all honesty, there's a small possibility that there could be an accident. It's not a high probability, but it's a small probability. And in the event of an accident, you might have to leave your houses and never come back again, as has happened in the case of Chernobyl. And but there are great benefits. We think there are great benefits of having nuclear power. How about, would you like to have that, right? That's the kind of process that one would like to see, but I don't think you'll ever get that.
I guess I would like to add that a lot of these problems would be solved and are solved in places where they can bring in the reactors in budget and on time. It has happened in some places in the past, and that would solve many of these problems.
And I think that one of the reasons why I brought up the idea of that activists went to state governments is that there has to be multiple processes for dealing with citizen objections, because the Nuclear Regulatory Commission has a kind of narrow, focus on atomic safety, essentially. But there's other forums that, where you can legitimately have questions about, should we have these kinds of power plants in this community at all? And so, at least in the United States, where you have a decentralized process, you do have to think about the complexity of local decision making, state decision making, and federal as well.
Right. A second kind of follow-up question to Tom. You mentioned that we're currently in the earning trust period. And I may be thinking of all the bad examples, but I can only think of aviation as an example of kind of a historical precedent where the industry said, oh, we'll just prove that it's safe. And eventually there was the record to back that up. Are there other historical precedents for earning trust, diffusing or resolving that lack of trust? Because in politics, when someone says they want to earn your trust, you run away as fast as possible. So I'm wondering,
other examples outside the nuclear industry. I mean, I do think though that in many ways you do see an uptick in public support for nuclear power during those periods where nothing major goes wrong. So I mean, I think there are there is some indication. The problem of this, of course, is that trust is earned very gradually, slowly, painfully over time, and is lost easily. So. You mentioned the aviation industry, but certainly, for nuclear power, there is indications that extended operation can improve public support for nuclear power.
Okay, I'd like to invite our committee members to start raising their hands if they have questions. But while they do that, I want to end the discussion portion with a question about this new era that we're entering, the small modular reactor era that Ramana was alluding to. That implies a very different model of nuclear deployment. These things would be deployed tens of thousands globally in pursuit of really an aggressive effort to kind of mitigate carbon emissions. Assuming we're locked into this paradigm, and we don't necessarily need to be, what are the implications on the public engagement process of pursuing more reactors closer to people, more siting decisions, still the same amount of overhead would need to be expended to engage in a proper public process, public participation process. So what are the implications of an SMR world on community engagement in the industry? Maybe I should throw this to Ramana because he's done quite a bit of work on SMRs.
Yeah. So first, I would say that, I don't think we are locked into the paradigm, because I don't think the paradigm is going to work. You're not going to see tens of thousands of SMRs being deployed anytime soon. But if that's it, hypothetically,
where it to succeed, that paradigm, and where we locked into.
Right. Yeah, and I think there's a tension there, and the tension has to do with the fact that SMRs are meant to be very centralized in their production and design and licensing and so on and so forth, to go out from one place to other places, right? There's a kind of to put it very bluntly, there's a very colonial enterprise there, right? Which is that it's going to go from the advanced Western countries to developing countries in these large numbers, where they basically have nothing to say about the design and so on and so forth, right? And all you can then say is, look, we have this gizmo which is going to come, and we're going to build one of these here. What do you have to say about it? And our experts have told us that it is safe, it can never melt down, etc., etc., etc. Right? That's the paradigm that we are seeing. Whereas I think that I'll sort of reiterate what I said, that we have to if there's going to be good process, it has to start with very open questions, right? Do we want this at all? What kind of conditions you going to have? And one of the reasons why I think I say that the SMR paradigm is not going to work as planned is because I don't think a lot of countries are willing to trust other countries and other experts to make it. They at least would like their national experts to examine these designs, to go through certain kinds of processes, right? And I think that's something which you are seeing in many countries where they say, we don't want to be guinea pigs for these new technologies. So you would first have to deploy them in large numbers in the United States, in Canada, and places like that, which are trying to develop these, and see for a while what the record has been. Have they been built on time? Have they sort of had problems in construction and things of that sort before you can go to other places?
I'd like to add something here. The real problem, of course, as I've tried to indicate, is nuclear war and proliferation, which nobody wants to talk about, and for which the current stalking horse is terrorism. And so if we're going to have these reactors propagated, you're going to have to solve the problem of proliferation and of stealing nuclear materials and so forth, because that, even if it doesn't become visible, is going to be the underlying deepest concerns that the public has. Whether people want to talk about it or not, got to have to solve that or it just won't happen.
I would like to kind of say that other societies do generally also accept technologies, Ramana, whether it's aviation, commercial aviation, advances in medicine, or iPhones. They're happy. So we come back, it seems, to two things. One is the dread risk inherent in nuclear. There's something different, secular, about nuclear power, or that they see the benefits of aviation and they see the benefits of iPhones much more readily than they do the benefits of nuclear power. So it seems like I'm going to stop there and ask our committee members to chime in with their questions, assuming we have any. I don't see any hands raised, but I may be.
This is Dick Meserve. I will
Yes.
start the video. I'm not finding a way to raise my hand. So that may be why you're not seeing any, because none of us have that capacity at the moment. Let me ask a question, however. Hopefully that can be corrected by the staff. It's very interesting presentation. So I would like to ask the question of Tom Wellock. And let me just say at the outset, his book, Safe Enough, I strongly encourage everyone who's watching to read it. It's an absolutely terrific, very, very interesting book about the development of probabilistic techniques and their application by the NRC over the years. My question for him is that he's mentioned that the NRC in this most recent era has tried to demonstrate competence, and it has developed these principles of regulation, which he displayed in his chart, which I can say from my own experience, they very sincerely seek to follow. But I have not detected, and I don't have any actual polling to show this, but I have not detected that this has resulted in any greater willingness to accept NRC decisions. And that the opposition has remained and about the same level of intensity. I think most people actually are comfortable with the NRC, but there is a core of people who are never going to be comfortable. But they're not seeing much of a change. And the question is whether there, for Tom, is whether there are some other things that the NRC should be doing that would help to assure greater public confidence in its decision making.
Well, of the principles that I listed, I think the one that gives them the greatest fits is clarity and making it plain to the general public how they arrive at their decisions. And as you're well aware, ascertaining the safety of light water reactors is a complex process that is kind of impenetrable to the outside. I think that in many ways the NRC has tried to do that in the past, things like the safety goal policy statement. But I think communications is a very difficult task for an organization dominated by engineers, who have to somehow communicate these decisions to the public. So I think in many ways, communication, which is a riddle that very few people have solved, this idea of how to deal with risk that is of low probability and high consequence is really is a major challenge. It's very hard to do, I think. I think that's probably one of the key areas, is to somehow make safety plain the way they wanted it to be back in the 1950s, that the public could grasp it and accept it.
Thanks, Tom. I should say a couple of things. The hand raising feature is in the reactions tab at the very bottom. And I would like to turn to Alison McFarlane for a question. Alison?
Thanks, Ahmed. I think this is a really interesting panel this morning. And I was struck in part by all the talks, of course, but by Spencer's talks, because it really made me think that nuclear has a lot to overcome to have success in the future. There is a long history stuck deep in our brains. Of course, now I'm locating myself in a particular time. I'm a particular age, and younger people may have a different experience than me. And of course, I'm in the United States, or I was in the United States. Now I'm in Canada, but it's I've had a particular experience, and others may have different ones, and I think that's important to keep in mind. But it still seems like there's a lot for nuclear to overcome in terms of the scariness that 100 years of experience has put on it. So I was also struck by Ramana's comment about the way to really have a good discussion on nuclear is to have a very open discussion. And I know we're going to hear more about this as time goes on in this particular workshop, because we're going to have experts from the waste area talking about this. But this is exactly what Canada is doing and has done. And I hate to, be waving Canada's flag, but I will, because there are at least 3 of us on this call from Canada. That's what they've done on the waste side of things. They have not presumed in their initial discussions about what to do with waste. They have not presumed a decision. They have not assumed that the waste will go underground. They start with a clean slate and say, what would you be comfortable with? Now that you've heard about some options, what do you think? And I think there are many lessons for nuclear energy to learn from that. Yes, climate change, I think we should say as a given, Spencer, that climate change is a massive threat. It's a truly apocalyptic threat. So what should we do going forward? I don't see many countries having those kinds of discussions. So yeah, you're welcome to comment.
Oh, it's tough. There's no question about it. And my main message is that it is very tough, and we're not going to be able to confront it head on. Really, the route forward is to make the reactors cheap enough and make the fossil fuels expensive enough. So that's the other side of the coin. We have to make people properly afraid of climate change and sort of divert things over in that direction. That's the only way forward I see.
Right. I'd like to go for a question from Richard Cupid, but before that, Ramana.
Yeah, can I just jump in very quickly? And I liked Alison's point about locating herself in the US and Canada. So when I think back to my childhood and what kind of images of the atom I got a lot of films division documentaries from the Indian government. Before every film, they would show one of these documentaries, and many of them were about how Homi Bhabha was the smartest scientist in India and what great stuff the Department of Atomic Energy was doing, right? So that was I never saw a single monster nuclear movie in my childhood, right? So I just want to say that, this is not a universal fact.
Right, thank you for that. Richard?
Thanks very much for very interesting presentations. I wonder if Ramana, you might go into a little more about your thinking about the acceptance in many states will depend upon the sharing of the technology. You know, I mean, that's been a classic case for many technologies, and certainly even in the nuclear era, you know, that many states wanted the power technology that the U.S. and others weren't willing to give many years, decades ago. Could you talk a little bit about that and how you see that progressing? You know, how would SMR producers have to address that likely response by a number of states? Thanks.
Yeah, I think that to the extent that SMRs can address that, they would have to do it by actually customizing SMRs for different countries, right? So just as the large reactors, when you go into China, the AP1000 is slightly different from the AP1000s that are being built in Georgia and was built in South Carolina. I think that's the kind of model that might actually work. That, you know, at least in those countries which have adequate technical capabilities, they will want to try and bring in some of the production into their countries. And you have to understand that I think for many of these governments as well, when they are trying to build nuclear power, one of the ways developing countries do that is by saying this is going to help us become good in advanced manufacturing, right? And so if everything is going to come as like an iPhone, then it is going to be very different. The thing, I think there's the difference between the iPhone kind of issue is that iPhones themselves might be coming in from Foxconn, but the kind of apps that can be put on the iPhone, which is also a huge industry, can be perfectly well localized, right? And so I don't see them as sort of analogous in that sense. So yeah, back to your question, I think, you know, to the extent that SMRs will have to go to other countries, they will have to involve those countries in manufacturing some part of either the fuel chain or the manufacturing chain that has to be set up.
All right, Kirsty.
Thank you. Yeah, wonderful presentations. Thank you all so much. So I'm just, you know, I'm really glad we're going into the next panel focusing on social science, because what I'm seeing is some really interesting characterizations of nuclear technology that I think expose some tendencies towards bias or perspective, which is really taken out of context. And I'll give you an example. You know, the focus on safety and spent fuel, for example, when we have that discussion about nuclear technologies, we never have that conversation in the context of other energy technologies. So, you know, 8 million premature deaths per year from fossil fuels, for example, is an issue that, you know, attracts almost no real attention in terms of, you know, compared to the fear and loathing that we see around, you know, safety issues with nuclear technologies, or the characterization of spent fuel as being as waste. And I'm really interested to hear from the panel, and maybe perhaps Spencer, you would be well placed to sort of tell us about how these kinds of sort of, you know, popular characterizations can then lead to certain perceptions which actually don't read across to evidence and real impacts.
One of the problems here, which Tom alluded to several times, is that the nuclear industry is an industry of engineers. And engineers, they think logically, they think in numbers. They think, okay, you know, we'll just explain it to them. You know, here's the chart. It shows the risks. You know, there's a 4 sigma chance, blah, blah, blah. That is not how the other people, most of the people in the world think. The anti-nuclear movement in particular, it used songs. Okay, it shows photographs of deformed frogs and talks about the tragedy of a misbirthed, you know, aborted child and that kind of a thing. They're just talking a wholly different universe of discourse. And we just have to admit that the nuclear industry doesn't have the capacity to address that. And really the only thing we can do is acknowledge that and not do our best not to wake it up. You know, do our best to talk in terms of well, this is going to be cheaper, or this is going to combat global warming. and just do our best to just stay as clear as we can from waking up these things. Now, admittedly, as I emphasized, for the next generation, it is not so visceral. And of course, for many people in the third world, also, it's not so visceral as it is for people of my generation, the duck and cover generation. So there is some hope there also. But the main thing is just don't wake it up. Don't prod it. Don't poke the beast.
So can I jump in quickly? I think, there is, this is a question that comes up a lot. And I think for most people, the way they would look at it is to say, we don't want either fossil fuels or coal or nuclear. It's like asking whether you want to die of heart attack or cancer. You don't want to die of either of them, right? So I don't think that, that's the right comparison. And the other point to which is important today is that there is another low carbon alternative, or a whole set of low carbon alternatives, the renewables, which have become much cheaper, right? So people don't have to be faced with this false choice of nuclear versus fossil fuels.
I should say, as we wrap up, that some of us would like to solve the problem and not just ignore it as well. I mean, there is clearly a problem here, whether it's the industries. I'm going to turn to Michael Ford.
I'd just like to address what Ramana just said, is that I would argue that the renewables industry has also not had to deal with their externalities because they're perceived as low carbon only and not treated the same way when it comes to the waste question. And so because they have much shorter life spans for those technologies, there's no solution really to windmill blades, wind turbine blades, where those go. So there's a massive both land use and waste and raw materials issue with using those technologies that does not scale to a multi-century solution to the energy problem. And so I think they're getting a free pass in this discussion by just because they have a low carbon and look nice, perhaps in some cases, so are not treated the same way in the discourse. So I just offer that.
Thanks, Mike. I agree, but we should also note the enormous challenges wind faces whenever they seek to site it anywhere. I mean, it's a phenomenally, my point is, you're right, this is not just a nuclear problem, even if we're just restricting it to the social acceptance challenge. I've got a question from the public, which is, what impact do the recent nuclear power plant project failures, like the South Carolina project, have on the public attitude towards new power plant development? And I want to tie this to the question of the reactors that never were, the hundreds of reactors that were proposed in the great bandwagon market and never actually built. To Spencer's point, is it a cost issue? Would these have been built if the cost came in, or was public opposition the fatal flaw that dragged down most of these projects? So can we dissect that somehow?
That's on you, Tom.
Okay. I would say I think there's general consensus that opposition only brought down about a handful of the plants. Most of them were canceled because of economic reasons, because whether you can blame that on regulatory overreach or flaws in the industry, that was the main cause. And certainly economic viability plays into public thinking. So yeah, I would say that certainly most of the industry was economic factors have played into negative attitudes toward nuclear power in the 1980s. It wasn't simply 3 Mile Island and Chernobyl, but basically the exhaustion of the idea that nuclear power was inevitable, that it was necessary, that it had a key role to play in making our lives better. Certainly in the 1980s had a major impact. And then I think the combination, certainly after Fukushima, of that accident, as well as a recognition that perhaps these plants were going to be expensive, played in as well.
Can I just quickly comment on that also? I think that what I see around the world is to essentially say that this happened in South Carolina or in Georgia, but it's not going to happen here, right? So but even though the early signs are that they are going to get repeated. For example, in the new scale proposal for US, the cost has been going up, but they cannot say, oh, it is going to be under $58 per megawatt hour, right? And it's only when the plant is completed and the electricity starts being generated that you will see that the cost is going to go up, but that's going to be too late.
James Rispoli is pointing out that optimism bias is often at work, and that's certainly true. All right, I think we've reached the termination of our panel. Thank you all so much for your presentations and for engaging with us in the discussion. And we're going to reconvene at 1:30 for our second panel on the social and decision sciences and what they tell us about the issues facing nuclear power. So thank you, Ramana. Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Spencer.
Thank you, Ahmed. Thank you, everybody, for inviting me.
Thank you.
You're offline now.